Hello, Charlies, ¿cómo estáis? A ver, me peino un poquito, ya me está creciendo mucho el pelo. Voy a quitar la música. Nos vamos a meter de lleno porque ya han empezado. Pensaba que iban a tardar un poquito más, que siempre tardan, pero se han metido directamente, así que vamos con ello.
Into Donald Trump's scheme, Donald Trump turned the mob on him. A mob that was chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." A mob that had built a hangman's gallows just outside the Capitol. Thanks in part to Mike Pence, our democracy withstood Donald Trump's scheme and the violence of January 6th. But the danger hasn't receded. Led by my colleague, Mr. Aguilar, today we'll lay out the facts for the American people. But first, I'll recognize my colleague from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for any opening statement she'd care to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me take just a few minutes today to put the topic of our hearing in broader context. In our last hearing, we heard unequivocal testimony that President Trump was told his election fraud allegations were complete nonsense. We heard this from members of the Trump campaign. We heard this from President Trump's campaign lawyers.
Bueno, lo que están haciendo básicamente es hablar de qué han ido las audiencias hasta ahora, por poner un poco de contexto para aquellos que lleguéis nuevos y no sepáis muy bien qué es esto. Estos son unas audiencias públicas, la tercera de ellas, el Comité Especial Congresual, que es un comité que aprobaron generalmente congresistas demócratas porque el Senado, los republicanos en el Senado no quisieron aprobar un comité independiente. Entonces, en este caso es un comité que está investigando el asalto al Capitolio, pero también la parte previa, ¿no? Los prolegómenos, qué es lo que sucedió antes, la gran mentira, la conocida como Big Lie de Trump y de sus aliados más locos, que decían que se había cometido... Bueno, locos igual es darles demasiado crédito, ¿no? O sea, en realidad estaba en algunos casos todo muy bien pensado, para decir que se habían robado las elecciones, que los demócratas habían hecho pucherazos y una teoría de la conspiración para manipular las elecciones. Entonces hubo una iniciativa por parte de Trump y algunos de sus aliados, no todos, que querían revertir los resultados de las elecciones, ¿no? Los resultados legítimos, con una acusación de fraude electoral a gran escala, en ningún caso demostrada. Entonces este comité lleva, creo que es aproximadamente un año investigando estas alegaciones contra Trump y los aliados que defendían esa gran mentira. Entonces están intentando demostrar como varios aspectos de esas estrategias, de esas iniciativas de la gran mentira. Lo que se ha demostrado hasta ahora a través de testificaciones, ¿no? Testigos, pruebas, evidencia, emails, mensajes que se han publicado y se han filtrado a lo largo de los últimos meses y sobre todo con estas dos audiencias previas que se celebraron, una la semana pasada y una creo que fue este lunes, pues han visto que había gente dentro del equipo de Trump, dentro de la Casa Blanca, que le dijeron a Trump: oye, Trump, esto es mentira, o sea, esto del fraude electoral no es verdad, no puedes lanzar estas acusaciones porque están basadas en una trola o no tienen ningún sentido, ¿no? O son bullshit directamente, son una puta mierda. Bueno, pues ese contexto ya lo tenemos. En lo que se van a centrar hoy es en demostrar que Donald Trump y sus aliados que estaban defendiendo esta gran mentira intentaron presionar a Mike Pence, al que fuera vicepresidente, para revertir los resultados de las elecciones. ¿Por qué Mike Pence? ¿Por qué el vicepresidente? Bueno, pues porque el vicepresidente tenía que liderar la sesión conjunta de la Cámara de Representantes y del Senado para certificar los resultados electorales de 2020, de las presidenciales. Entonces, era una cita meramente institucional, ¿no? Que se celebraba... meramente ceremonial, que se celebraba el 6 de enero de 2021 para certificar los resultados electorales. ¿Qué son los resultados electorales? Bueno, no es una cuestión de el voto popular, de lo que los ciudadanos votaron en 2020, en noviembre. Lo que se certificaba era los votos electorales. Tú, cuando ganas un estado como California, ¿vale? Por ejemplo, Biden, que ganó California, te llevabas 55 votos electorales. Todos de ellos, porque has ganado el voto popular dentro de ese estado. Entonces, esos 55 votos electorales son personas que luego van a ir a lo que se conoce como colegio electoral, donde se reúnen todos los electores, todos esos votos electorales de todos los estados, de los 50 estados del país, y votan por el candidato que les toca según el candidato que haya ganado en uno u otro estado. Entonces, los 55 electores de California votarán por Biden, los los tres electores que hay en Wyoming votarán por Trump. Entonces, lo que decía Trump y sus aliados es que en estados como Georgia, Pensilvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, pues no había ganado Biden, había ganado Trump. Por tanto, los electores que iban a votar por Biden, porque Biden había ganado el voto popular en esos estados, en realidad esos votos no valen, se debían dar como no válidos, y eso es lo que querían que hiciera Mike Pence. Lo que querían es que Mike Pence dijera: no, estos votos no valen, no los voy a certificar como parte de esta ceremonia que organizamos el 6 de enero, así que volved a vuestros estados, que vengan electores a favor de Trump y certificaremos esos votos a favor de Trump, lo cual es una cosa mega antidemocrática. O sea, es una absoluta locura que en algún momento se pudiera llegar a permitir eso, pero esas presiones existían contra Mike Pence. Entonces, lo dicho, hoy se va a intentar demostrar que existieron esas presiones, estaban basadas en una mentira, estaban basadas en iniciativas antidemocráticas que pensaron, ¿no?, manipular o revertir los resultados de las elecciones del año 2020. Así que vamos a seguir escuchando y luego, pues, a ver qué conclusiones sacamos. Yo reaccionaré a las revelaciones más interesantes, porque si me pongo a parar no nos vamos a enterar de un pimiento. Por cierto, no sé por qué no me deja esta vez traducir los subtítulos en directo, pero bueno.
Without objection, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, for an
Pete
opening
Aguilar es
statement.
el congresista que va a liderar la sesión de hoy. Por cierto, es este hombre.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we intend to show the American people that January 6th was not an isolated incident. In the weeks culminating before, it was a legal scheme and deception. We've already learned that President Trump knew he lost the 2020 election. Shortly after, he began to look for a way to circumvent our country's most fundamental civic tradition, the peaceful transfer of power. The president latched on to a dangerous theory and would not let go because he was convinced it would keep him in office. We witnessed firsthand what happened when the President of the United States weaponized this theory. The Capitol was overrun, police officers lost their lives, and the Vice President was taken to a secure location because his safety was in jeopardy. Let's take a look at the effect of Donald Trump's words and actions. I want to warn our audience that the video contains explicit content.
Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us, and if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. And Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you, I will tell you right now.
I'm telling you what, I'm hearing the Pence just caved.
No.
Is that true? I'm hearing reports that Pence caved.
No.
I'm telling you, if Pence caved, we're gonna drag motherfuckers through the streets. You fucking politicians are gonna get fucking drugged through the streets.
Yes.
I guess the hope is that there's such
O sea, están diciendo que quieren sacar a Mike Pence a las calles. Dicen, se ha escondido Mike Pence, vamos a por él. Aquí están preguntando, bueno, esto ya lo vimos, ¿no? Que dónde está Mike Pence, porque decía, o sea, él era la persona indicada, ¿no?, señalada por Trump para que revirtiera los resultados, y lo dijo en sus discursos. Dijo: Mike Pence es la persona que tiene que tomar una decisión hoy sobre lo que hay que hacer por el futuro de Estados Unidos, porque yo tengo que ser presidente, etc. Aquí veíamos el nudo que se puso, que se suponía que era para colgar a Mike Pence si no seguía lo que le pedía, hacer lo que le pedía a Trump.
Where President Trump's most radical supporters led a violent attack on the Capitol and threatened to hang President Trump's own vice president. You'll hear from witnesses that Donald Trump pressured Mike Pence to adopt a legally and morally bankrupt idea that the vice president could choose who the next president can be. You'll hear about how the vice president, the White House counsel, and others told Donald Trump that the vice president had no such authority. But President Trump would not listen.
Sí, en realidad lo que le dijeron sus consejeros cercanos, tanto consejeros políticos como legales, a Trump, es que Mike Pence no tenía esa autoridad legal para poder revertir los resultados o para no certificar las elecciones. No, o sea, a nivel constitucional no tenía esa posibilidad Mike Pence. Y sin embargo, pues seguía existiendo la teoría de la conspiración de que sí que podía y que había que presionarle para que lo hiciera.
Courage to do what needed to be done. Let me be clear. Vice President Pence did the right thing that day. He stayed true to his oath to protect and defend the Constitution. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this afternoon. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. We're honored to have two distinguished witnesses who advised Vice President regarding his role on January 6th.
Son dos testigos que aconsejaron al vicepresidente Mike Pence acerca de esta posible decisión que tenía que tomar, ¿no?, sobre si revertir o no los resultados.
And George H.W. Bush. He was appointed by the latter to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals.
Este es un ex juez republicano.
He served from 1991 to 2006. He provided critical advice for Vice President Pence.
O sea, llegó a ser juez federal del Cuarto Circuito, o sea, es una corte bastante alta. Es antes de llegar al Supremo, una corte de apelaciones.
He's written that the Vice President does not have the power to select the next President of the United States. He's also written that contrary theory espoused by one of his own former law clerks was, quote, incorrect at every turn. We're also joined today by one of the people who was with Vice President Pence on January 6th. Greg Jacob was counsel to Vice President Pence. He conducted a thorough analysis of the role of the Vice President in the joint session of Congress under the Constitution, the Electoral Count Act, and 230 years of historical practice. But he also has firsthand information about the attack on the Capitol.
Bueno, en este caso Greg Jacob está diciendo que era un consejero de Mike Pence, que se estudió pues toda la historia legal e institucional acerca del recuento electoral y de lo que dice la Constitución al respecto de cuál es el rol del vicepresidente en esa ceremonia. Y lo que dice es que no solo eso, no solo estudió y aconsejó a Pence acerca de qué es lo que estaba en su mano, sino que aparte estuvo con él durante el asalto al Capitolio. Entonces tiene, pues, fue testigo de primera mano de lo que sucedió aquel día y el hecho de que la seguridad de Pence estuviera puesta en duda, ¿no?
I now recognize myself for questions. In the United States, the people choose our representatives, including the highest official in the land, the President of the United States. The American people did this on November 3rd, 2020. But President Trump did not like the outcome. He did everything he could to change the result of the election. He tried litigation, 62 cases, in fact, and that failed. He tried to pressure state legislatures to reverse the results of the election in their states, but they refused. He tried to enlist the Department of Justice in his efforts to overturn election results, but officials leading the department refused to comply. So eventually, he latched on to a completely nonsensical and anti-democratic theory that one man, his own vice president.
Está diciendo que Donald Trump, a lo largo de los 2 meses después de las elecciones del mes de noviembre, intentó muchas iniciativas diferentes para revertir los resultados y para perpetuarse seguir en el poder. Por ejemplo, un montón de casos judiciales para intentar desafiar los resultados de estados como Georgia, o como Pensilvania, como Michigan o Wisconsin. Arizona también. Luego intentó usar a su Departamento de Justicia como arma legal o para poder conseguir las papeletas de voto de algunos estados como Georgia, intentar también revertir los resultados en esos estados. Cuando eso no ha funcionado, lo que hace es optar por Mike Pence, ¿no? Por una sola figura para ayudarle a llevar a cabo sus iniciativas.
The first time that I had a conversation with the Vice President about the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act was in early December, around December 7th. The Vice President called me over to his West Wing office and told me that he had been seeing and reading things that suggested that he had a significant role to play on January 6th in announcing the outcome of the election. He told me that he had been first elected to Congress in 2000 and that one of his earliest memories as a congressman was sitting in on the 2001 certification, and he recalled that Al Gore had gavelled down a number of objections that had been raised to Florida. And he asked me mechanically, how does this work at the joint session? What are the rules? And I told the Vice President that, in fact, I had a fairly good idea of how things work, that actually there aren't rules that govern the joint session, but what there is a provision of the Constitution that's just one sentence long, and then an Electoral Count Act that had been passed in 1887. And I told the Vice President that I could put a memo together for him overnight that would explain the applicable rules.
O sea, dice que Mike Pence le llamó por teléfono a primeros de diciembre y le preguntó, oye, esto de contar los votos electorales, ¿qué implica? ¿Cuál es mi papel?
What you have is a sentence in the Constitution that is inartfully drafted. But the Vice President's first instinct when he heard this theory was that there was no way that our framers, who abhorred concentrated power, who had broken away from the tyranny of George III, would ever have put one person, particularly not a person who had a direct interest in the outcome because they were on the ticket for the election, in a role to have decisive impact on the outcome.
Claro, que dices, ¿cómo van a hacer los padres fundadores escribir una frase en la Constitución que dé tanto poder a una figura como el vicepresidente, que es una de las personas que puede ser reelegida, ¿no? Que puede estar en la reelección, como es el caso de Mike Pence? ¿Cómo van a poner tanto poder en una persona para certificar los votos electorales? Es absurdo, y eso es lo que pensó Mike Pence por instinto, y por eso acudió a sus consejeros para que le dijeran qué coño pasaba.
Hear more today about how, despite this conclusion by you and other top legal advisors, the former president used this discredited theory in his campaign to pressure the vice president to decide the outcome of the presidential election. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Judge Ludig, thank you as well for being here with us today. You issued a very important statement earlier today, which I urge all Americans to read. And I'd like to ask you, Judge, about one of the sentences in your statement and ask if you could explain to us the significance of it. You say, had the Vice President of the United States obeyed the President of the United States, America would immediately have been plunged into what would have been tantamount to a revolution within a paralyzing constitutional crisis. Could you elaborate on that for us, Judge?
Dijo que se habría producido una crisis constitucional si Pence llega a intervenir. Que se muere tú.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chairman. That passage in my statement this morning referenced the most foundational concept in America, which is the rule of law. Thus, as I interpret your question, you are asking about that foundational truth of these United States,
Dios mío, qué coñazo
which we call America.
¿Se toma una pausa de 7 segundos por cada palabra?
The foundational truth is the rule of law.
Ya lo has dicho eso.
That foundational truth is, for the United States of America, the profound truth. But it's not merely the profound truth for the United States. It's also the simple truth, the simple foundational truth
Me encanta que hayáis dos al mismo tiempo que habéis dicho. Me recuerda a AMLO.
Thus, in my view, the hearings being conducted by this select committee are examining that profound truth,
¡Oh, my God! ¿Qué está pasando?
namely the rule of law in the United States of America.
¡Hostias!
The
Está
specific
completamente...
question, of course, before you and before the nation, not before me, is whether
A ver qué está diciendo la gente en
that
Twitter.
foundational rule of law was supremely violated on January 6, 2021. Now, to the question specifically that you asked, Madam Vice Chair.
Oh my God.
I believe that had Vice President Pence obeyed the orders,
Si Mike Pence llega a obedecer las órdenes,
and the President of the United States of America
si llega a obedecer las órdenes del presidente de Estados
during
Unidos
the joint session
en la sesión conjunta
of the Congress of the United States
del Capitolio de Estados Unidos,
on January 6,
el 6 de enero
2021,
de 2021,
and declared Donald Trump
y hubiera declarado a Donald Trump
the next
como
President of the
el
United
próximo presidente de
States,
Estados Unidos,
notwithstanding that then President Trump had
lost,
lost the Electoral College
sin tener en
vote,
cuenta que Donald
as
Trump
well
había
as
perdido
the
las elecciones,
popular vote in the 2020 presidential election.
ha dicho que perdió el voto popular y perdió el voto electoral
That
también.
declaration of Donald Trump as the next president
Esa declaración de Trump como el próximo presidente
plunged America
habría hundido a América, a Estados Unidos,
into what I believe
habría hundido a
would
América en
have
lo que yo
been
creo que es,
tantamount to a
que habría sido,
revolution
en resumidas cuentas, una revolución
within
dentro de
a constitutional crisis
una crisis constitucional
in America, which in my view, and I'm only one man, would have been the first constitutional crisis
¿Qué está pasando, tío? Que no le dejen hablar más, ¿eh?
since the founding of the Republic.
Thank you very much, Judge, for your solemn attention to these issues and
La
for your
puta.
appearance here today. We're going to describe and discuss in detail what happened. And as we do, I'm going to describe a few of the details now of some of the actions taken by a gentleman named Kenneth
Dicen en el
Cheeseborough.
Twitter.
After
Estoy teniendo la sensación... Oh, no, perdón. Me estoy imaginando ahora mismo cómo serían los juicios del juez Luttig, que claro, debería ser un coñazo que flipas. Y dice uno, puede que muera de causas naturales antes de que el juez Luttig termine su respuesta. Joder, ya te digo, macho, qué destrozo.
Mr. Cheeseborough wrote to Mayor Giuliani that the Vice President is charged with, quote, making judgments about what to do if there are conflicting votes, close quote. Mr. Cheeseborough wrote that when the joint session of Congress got to Arizona in the alphabetical list of states, the Vice President should not count the Biden votes, quote, because there are two slates of votes. His justification, which we will learn more about in our next hearing, was that a group of Trump supporters in Arizona and other swing states decided to proclaim themselves the true electors for the state, creating two sets of electors.
Esto es lo que decía yo,
The
¿no?
official electors selected by the state.
O sea, que habían hecho dos grupos de electores. Por ejemplo, en Arizona, bueno, sí, en Arizona, es que no me acuerdo cuántos son en Arizona, que son, a ver, 1, 2, 3, 7, 6,
As you will see on the screen shortly, Judge David Carter wrote,
7,
quote, "The draft memo pushed a strategy that
no,
knowingly
sí,
violated the
8,
electoral count."
creo que son 8 votos electorales en Arizona. Bueno, pero lo que dicen es que esos 8 o 9 votos electorales en Arizona, como Biden había ganado el voto popular en Arizona, pues esos 9 votos electorales irían para Biden y irían a votar al colegio electoral por Biden. Bueno, pues lo que dijeron los aliados de Trump es, no, vamos a elegir a un grupo paralelo de electores que votarían por Trump, por si acaso Mike Pence puede optar por esa alternativa y decir, no, estos son los votos electorales que vamos a contar, no vamos a certificar a aquellos que han votado por Biden.
At the joint session of Congress on January 6th. You will see portions of this memo on the screen. In the first line, he wrote, quote, 7 states have transmitted dual slates of electors to the President of the Senate. But Dr. Eastman goes on to rely on those so-called dual slates of electors to say that Vice President Pence could simply declare President Trump the winner of the 2020 election. Mr. Jacob, were there in fact dual slates of electors from 7 states?
No, there were not.
And just a few days after that, Dr. Eastman wrote another memo. This one, quote, wargaming out several scenarios. He knew the outcome he wanted, and he saw a way to go forward if he simply pretended that fake electors were real. You will see that memo up on the screen now. Here, Dr. Eastman says the Vice President can reject the Biden electors from the states that he calls, quote, disputed. Under several of the scenarios, the Vice President...
John Eastman es un abogado que más o menos dio las justificaciones legales inexistentes para que Mike Pence pudiera negar esos votos electorales de Biden, ¿no? Entonces, este es un memorándum en el que intentaba demostrar que se podía hacer cuando en realidad no se podía hacer. O sea, eran argumentos legales de mierda, basados en nada.
2020, just 4 days before Dr. Eastman sent this memo, Dr. Eastman himself admitted in an email that the fake electors had no legal weight, referring to the fake electors as, quote, dead.
O sea, el propio Eastman, este abogado que os digo, sabía perfectamente que esos votos electorales, esos electores, no tenían ningún peso legal. O sea, no... Era una tontería, una invención.
Trump electors in those 7 states who were not certified by any state authority have any legal significance.
Lutig. Madre mía. Dios santo.
Congresswoman, there was no support whatsoever in either the Constitution of the United States nor the laws of the United States for the Vice President, frankly, ever to count alternative.
Dice que no, el vicepresidente jamás ha tenido autoridad en la historia de Estados Unidos para reconocer electores alternativos.
The designated state official in the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I did notice in the passage from Mr. Eastman's memorandum, and I took a note on it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he said in that passage that there was both legal authority as well as historical precedent.
Madre mía.
I do know what Mr. Eastman was referring to when he said that there was historical precedent for doing so.
Está diciendo que no sabe a qué se refería Eastman cuando decía que había un precedente histórico para esta movida. Estaba en no.
There was no historical precedent.
Incorrecto. No tenía
From the beginning
ninguna base.
Of the founding in 1789 that even as mere historical precedent, as distinguished from legal precedent, would support the possibility of the Vice President of the United States.
Además es que es muy coñazo porque se nota que a veces opta por frases que sabe que le van a ayudar a seguir pensando qué es lo que va a decir después, ¿no? Entonces dice, vicepresidente de Estados Unidos de América, que le habría permitido el fundación legal y constitucional de Estados Unidos de América, ¿no? Es como todo el rato, puta madre, tío, es insoportable.
If the committee wanted, but it would be a digression.
Thank you very much, Judge. I know my colleagues will be pursuing that issue in more depth, and now I'd like to yield back.
No quiero que lo hagan. No quiero que le pregunten más.
Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, and staff counsel, Mr. John Wood, for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're fortunate to have a bipartisan staff. Senior Investigative Counsel John Wood previously served as United States Attorney in Missouri under President George W. Bush. He and I will share today's lines of questioning. Mr. Wood?
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. Judge Ludig, I had the incredible honor of serving as one of your law clerks. Another person who did was John Eastman. And you have written that Dr. Eastman's theory that the vice president could determine.
Dice que tanto él como Eastman, el abogado este que escribió el memorándum sobre las posibilidades de Pence injustificadas de poder revertir los resultados, que trabajaron para Lutig. Se va a hacer meme este tío.
It was my honor, Mr. Wood, to have you serve as my law clerk. I could answer that question perfectly if I had at my disposal either Mr. Eastman's tweet or my own analytical tweet of September 21st, but I don't. But that said, let me try to remember the analysis of Mr. Eastman's analysis.
And Judge, I can read to you and to the audience, I think what was a really key passage from your very
menos mal, se están
insightful
empezando a dar cuenta de que no pueden dejarle hablar durante 7 horas. Hazle preguntas de sí o no.
At every turn of the analysis in his January 2nd memorandum, beginning with his claim that there were legitimate competing slates of electors presented from 7 states, and you've already addressed that issue. But your next sentence said, continuing to his conclusion that the vice president could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from the 7 states from which competing slates were
Cuando
allegedly
hacías una presentación en el colegio y te pasabas 3 minutos leyendo la diapositiva.
That Dr.
Real.
Eastman was incorrect in his conclusion that the vice president could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from these disputed states.
I understand. As I previously stated in response to Congresswoman Cheney, there was no basis in the Constitution or laws of the United States at all for the theory espoused by Mr. Eastman. At all. None. With all respect to my co-panelist, he said, I believe in partial response to one of the Select Committee's questions.
¿Vosotros tenéis la sensación de que igual está saboteando las audiencias?
12th Amendment was, he thought, inartfully written. That single sentence is not inartfully written. It was pristine clear that the President of the Senate on January 6th, the incumbent Vice President of the United States, had little substantive constitutional authority, if any, at all. The 12th Amendment, the single sentence that Mr. Jacob refers to, says in substance that following the transmission of the certificates to the Congress of the United States.
Saborea cada palabra. Me podría comer un colín y una aceituna, 7 trozos de jamón, 3 gambas cada vez que pausa, tú. Me cago en la mar.
That the presiding officer shall open the certificates in the presence of the Congress of the United States in joint session.
Venga, hombre.
It then says unmistakably, not even that the Vice President himself shall count the electoral votes. It clearly says merely that
dice, siento que se está calentando un poco. Las palabras vienen en ráfagas más grandes.
Shall then be counted. It was the Electoral Count Act of 1887 that
Sí, o sea, a mí lo que me está pasando también es que intento prestar atención, pero tarda tanto en enlazar palabras e ideas que me pierdo y me distraigo.
the simple words of the 12th Amendment in order to construct for the country a process for the counting of the sacred process for the counting of the electoral votes from the states, that neither our original Constitution nor even the 12th Amendment had done.
Es que está repitiendo todo el rato lo mismo.
Irony, if you will,
Está diciendo que sí, que no hay base para que, o sea, no hay base en la Constitución y en las leyes de Estados Unidos en absoluto para la teoría que defendía el abogado Eastman.
When Congress passed the Electoral Count Act, the nation had been in considerable turmoil during at least 5 of its presidential elections.
No, sí, o sea, habla tan lento que es imposible entenderle.
As soon thereafter,
o sea, yo lo que quiero ver es cómo hacen las televisiones para poder resumir sus palabras, porque o sea, o cortan o hacen cortes como si fuera un vídeo de YouTube o vamos.
that piece of legislation is not only a work in progress for the country, but at this moment in history, an important work in progress that needs to take place. That was long-winded, I understand.
Well, Judge Ludig, at the risk of oversimplifying for the non-lawyers who are watching, is it fair to say that the 12th Amendment basically says two things happen. The vice president opens the certificates and the electoral votes are counted. Is it that straightforward?
Di yes y ya está. Oh my God.
I would not want that to be my testimony before the Congress of the United States. The language of the 12th Amendment is that simple.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Jacob, I have a question for you. I believe during your deposition before this committee, you said something to the effect of you'd read every word written about the 12th Amendment, the Electoral Count Act, and historical practice. I know in response to the chairman's earlier question, you gave your bottom line conclusion, but can you tell us a little bit about the process that you and your colleagues went through of researching this issue and what conclusion you came to after your thorough research?
So, you, as a lawyer who's analyzing a constitutional provision, you start with the constitutional text, you go to structure, you go to history. So we started with the text. We did not think that the text was quite as unambiguous as Judge Ludig indicated. In part, we had a constitutional crisis in 1876 because in that year,
Es que además no es solo una cuestión de que las declaraciones de él fueran lentas y fuera difícil seguirlo, sino que aparte que es verdad que ha sido ambiguo. O sea, estaba como dejando siempre lugar a la interpretación en vez de hacer declaraciones directas, que como juez igual te quieres tomar más pausa a la hora de llegar a conclusiones muy específicas, pero es que parecía que está dándole como argumentos a los que están a favor de Trump para decir, bueno, esto no se sostiene mucho.
Now I'm in complete agreement with Judge Ludig. It is unambiguous that the Vice President does not have the authority to reject electors. There is no suggestion of any kind that it does. There is no mention of rejecting or objecting to electors anywhere in the 12th Amendment. And so the notion that the Vice President could do that certainly is not in the text. But the problem that we had and that John Eastman raised in our discussions was we had all seen that in Congress in 2000, in 2004, in 2016, there had been objections raised to various states. And those had even been debated in 2004. And so here you have an amendment that says nothing about objecting or rejecting, and yet we did have some recent practice of that happening within the terms of the Electoral Count Act. So we started with that text. And I recall in my discussion with the Vice President, he said, I can't wait to go to heaven and meet the framers and tell them the work that you did in putting together our Constitution is a work of genius. Thank you. It was divinely inspired. There is one sentence that I would like to talk to you a little bit about. So then we went to structure. And again, the Vice President's first instinct here is so decisive on this question. There's just no way that the framers of the Constitution, who divided power and authority, who separated it out, who had broken away from George III.
Para los que no habéis entendido, lo que estaba diciendo era que Mike Pence dijo como broma, no, o sea, tengo unas ganas locas de llegar al cielo, encontrarme a los padres fundadores y decirles, oye, vuestro trabajo en componer la Constitución fue un trabajo de genios, pero quiero hablaros de un problemilla que tengo con una de las frases que escribisteis, que es con la 12ª enmienda de la que se está hablando hoy, ¿no? Que es la que habla del recuento de los votos electorales y demás, y que es la que dice que en ningún caso, o sea, no dice en ningún momento que se pueda objetar, ¿no? O se puedan presentar objeciones a los votos electorales.
Had not claimed authority to return electoral votes back to the states. In the entire history of the United States, not once had a joint session ever returned electoral votes back to the states to be counted. And in the crisis of 1876, Justice Bradley of the United States Supreme Court, who supplied the decisive final vote on that commission, had specifically looked at that question and said, first, The Vice President clearly doesn't have authority to decide anything, and by the way, also does not have authority to conduct an investigation by sending things back out.
Se ha arreglado ya, ¿no?
Tell you the answer cannot possibly be that the Vice
¿No se oye
President has
nada?
that authority. As the committee already played the Vice President's remarks, there is almost no idea that any one person would choose the American President. And then unbroken historical practice for 230 years that the Vice President did not have such an authority.
Thank you. I reserve the remainder of my time.
Mr. Jacob, you weren't the only one who knew that the legal theory was wrong, though. Here's what various advisors to the president
Bueno, ahora van a poner
thought about
vídeos de
that
gente
theory.
que también sabía dentro de la Casa Blanca que eso era mentira, ¿no? O sea que no.
You've been clear repeatedly with Mr. Meadows about you and the Vice President having a different view about his authority on January 6th.
I believe I had.
Did Mr. Meadows ever explicitly or tacitly agree with you or say, yeah, that makes sense or okay?
I believe that that Mark did agree.
What makes you say that?
I believe that's what he told me. But as I mentioned, I think Mark had told so many people so many different things that it was not something that that I would necessarily accept as, okay, well, that means that's resolved.
I see. Tell me more what he told you on this topic.
Well, I think it was that, the Vice President doesn't have any broader role. And I think he was understanding of that.
So despite the fact that he may have said other things to the President or others, to you, he said he understands the Vice President has no role.
Yes.
Okay. Did he say that to you several times?
A couple times.
Before January 6th?
Yes.
The way it was communicated to me was that Pat Cipollone thought the idea was nutty and had at one point confronted Eastman basically with the same.
Bueno, están diciendo que Eastman era consciente de que eso era mentira, ¿no? De que no había una base legal para pedir revertir los resultados de las elecciones, ¿no? Para que Mike Pence tuviera esa opción. Y aquí están hablando, pues el que fuera ex jefe de gabinete de Mike Pence, está hablando gente que era consejero dentro de la Casa Blanca. Aquí Eric Hersman, que había sido abogado en la Casa Blanca.
That the power to choose the next president would be sitting with the vice president.
Do you know if Mr. Clark or Mr. Morgan, is it Morgan, thought about that, Mr. Eastman's advice?
Yeah, they thought he was crazy.
Do you know if they ever expressed an opinion on whether they thought the vice president had the power that John Eastman said he did?
I know for a fact I heard both say that his theory was crazy, that there was no.
Lo mismo, ¿no? O sea, que en la Casa Blanca eran muy conscientes de que la teoría de Eastman, del abogado ese, no tenía base. Pero bueno, es importante que también enseñen que mucha gente dentro de la Casa Blanca era consciente de que eso era una locura, ¿no? Que no había ningún argumento legal que sostuviera lo que estaban pretendiendo.
Hold on a second, I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that you believe the vice president, acting as president of the Senate, can be the sole decision maker as to, under your theory, who becomes the next president of the United States? And you said yes. I said, are you out of your effing mind? Right? And
Dice, le pregunto, o sea, ¿tú crees de verdad que el vicepresidente de Estados Unidos como presidente del Senado tiene la posibilidad de decir quién es el próximo presidente de Estados Unidos porque le sale del pito? Y dice, pues estás completamente loco.
That your theory is this is how you're going to invalidate their votes because you think the election was stolen. And I said, they're not going to tolerate that. I said, you're going to cause riots in the streets. and he said words to the effect of there's been violence in the history of our country to protect the democracy or protect the republic.
LOL. Porque él le dijo, vamos a ver, si de repente declaras que esos votos electorales no valen y le das la presidencia al que no ha ganado, por una diferencia de 7 millones de votos, la gente va a salir a las calles a decir, ¿qué cojones, no? Va a haber violencia en las calles. Y bueno, también esto Eastman, el abogado este loco. Bueno, ha habido violencia en las calles en toda la historia de Estados Unidos.
White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows that, quote, "We can't lose the entire White House counsel's office. I do not see January 6th happening the way he is being told." A few days later, on January 5th, Mr. Hannity wrote to Mr. Meadows that, quote, "I'm very worried the next 48 hours. Pence pressure, White House counsel will leave." While Sean Hannity was apparently very concerned about the possibility that the White House counsel would resign in protest.
Bueno, este es Sean Hannity, el de Fox News, ¿no? Que está haciendo recomendaciones directas a Mark Meadows, el que fuera jefe de gabinete con Trump en la parte final de su presidencia. Y lo que estaba diciéndole es, oye, a ver, que yo creo que la interpretación que están haciendo del 6 de enero no es así. Trump lo que debería es volverse a Florida y dedicarse a atacar a Biden, que la va a cagar a diario, lo cual pues tampoco va muy lejos de la realidad.
Are you aware of instances where Pat Cipollone threatened to resign?
I kind of, like I said, my interest at that time was on trying to get as many pardons done, and I know that he was always, him and the team were always saying, "Oh, we're going to resign. We're not going to be here if this happens, if that happens." So I kind of took it up to just be whining, to be honest with you.
Bueno, aquí está diciendo Pat Cipollone, que era abogado también de la Casa Blanca, que amenazó varias veces con dimitir si seguían con esa estrategia, ¿no? de intentar revertir los resultados el 6 de enero. Entonces aquí a Jared Kushner, el yerno de Trump, le preguntaron, oye, ¿es verdad que amenazaron con dimitir? Y dice que puede ser, pero que él solo lo vio como que se estaban quejando, ¿no? Que eran unos lloricas.
The morning of January 6th, I think he called me out of the blue, right? And I was like getting dressed, and we had an intellectual discussion about Eastman's, I don't know if it's Eastman's theory per se, but the VP's role. And he was asking me my view and analysis and then the practical implications of it. And when we finished, he said, "Rick, I believe that, you're probably right." I think he thought when we're done that it would be something he'd have to consider if he was sitting on the bench. But he'd probably come down in that, you couldn't interpret it or sustain the argument long term.
But Mayor Giuliani seemed to admit that the theory was wrong, did not stop him from going before the crowd just a few hours later on January 6th and saying the exact opposite. Here's Mayor Giuliani's speech at the Ellipse rally on January 6th.
Esto es lo que dice, es que en conversación con el abogado este de Trump de la Casa Blanca, ahora lo digo, espera.
2 points. Number one, every single thing that has been
Eastman es el de la derecha, ¿eh?
as the plan for today.
Ese de ahí, perdón, el de la izquierda, el de la derecha de
I
Julian.
have Professor Eastman here with me to say a few words about that. He's one of the preeminent constitutional scholars in the United States.
As we come up at the top of the hour, we're going to have to end our coverage of this January 6th hearing on the NBC network. My colleagues and I will continue our coverage on the hearings on our streaming platform, NBC News Now.
At the Ellipse on January 6th.
And all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not.
Bueno, a ver, lo que está diciendo aquí, lo que había dicho antes uno de los abogados de la Casa Blanca de Trump, era que, oye, que Rudy Giuliani me admitió por teléfono que no había forma de que Mike Pence tuviera esas funciones suficientes como para revertir los resultados. Y entonces Giuliani, o sea, como digo, le dio la razón y luego, sin embargo, se fue al meeting del 6 de enero, eso fue en la misma mañana, se fue al meeting de Trump, le dio la palabra a Eastman para que dijera todas esas tonterías.
If the Vice President did what you were asking him to do, we would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court, wouldn't we? And he initially started it, well, I think maybe you would lose only 7-2. And after some further discussion, acknowledged, well, yeah, you're right, we would lose 9-0.
I appreciate that. In our investigation, the Select Committee has obtained evidence
El propio Mike Pence está dando a entender que Samuel Alito y Clarence Thomas, dos jueces conservadores del Supremo, tomarían una decisión antidemocrática para defender al Partido Republicano y a Trump. O sea, a ese nivel estamos.
An idea was proposed that the Vice President could
Eso seguro que lo ha
determine which
cazado alguien
electors
más.
to count at the joint session of Congress. But the person writing in blue eviscerates that argument. The person who wrote the comments in blue wrote, quote, "The 12th Amendment only says that the President of the Senate opens the ballots in the joint session and then, in the passive voice, that the votes shall then be counted." The comments in blue further state, "Nowhere does it suggest that the President of the Senate gets to make the determination on his own." Judge Ludig, does it surprise you that the author of those comments in blue was in fact John Eastman?
Yes, it does, Congressman. But let me, watching this unfold, let me try to unpack what was at the root of what I have called the blueprint to overturn the 2020 election. And it is this, and I had foreshadowed this answer in my earlier testimony to Congresswoman Cheney. Mr. Eastman, from the beginning, said to the President that there was both legal as well as historical.
Yo creo, a ver, un momento. Creo que nos voy a hacer un favor a todos y vamos a quitar esto. Y más adelante haré un resumen o algo en Twitter, porque es que, o sea, nos vamos a morir y creo que nos vamos a aburrir y no vamos a prestar atención, no vamos a sacar conclusiones dignas de qué es lo que está pasando. Entonces, luego haré un hilo en Twitter, si eso, con las conclusiones que han salido hoy, o si no, los comentamos la semana que viene cuando ya hayamos visto más audiencias. Pero bueno, pensaba que estaría más movidito. Entiendo que luego para el tramo final de la audiencia, que esto igual se alarga hoy más de 2 horas, pensaba que iba a ser solo 1 hora, pero lo vemos con mayor profundidad otro día. Pero el resumen de lo que han contado hasta ahora, que es que en realidad se puede resumir en 2 líneas, ¿no? Que es que han llamado a muchos testigos, incluido a estos 2, para decir, oye, mira, que la base de la teoría de poder presionar a Mike Pence, al ex vicepresidente, para que durante la cita ceremonial de certificar los resultados electorales del 6 de enero, eso, en realidad, él no podía tener esas funciones. No está argumentado ni a nivel institucional, ni a nivel histórico, ni a nivel legal. O sea, no hay forma, no hay base de ningún tipo que justifique que Mike Pence pudiera rechazar los votos electorales que le interesaran y optar por unos votos electorales alternativos para poder darle la presidencia a Donald Trump. Además es que no tiene ningún sentido si lo piensas, tal y como ha dicho Greg Jacob, que era consejero de Mike Pence, que dice, o sea, si tú lo piensas, ¿cómo los padres fundadores van a permitir que una sola persona, un vicepresidente de Estados Unidos, que en muchas ocasiones, sobre todo si se ha presentado a la reelección, pues es parte interesada de que no gane su rival? ¿Cómo demonios va a tener tanto poder como para poder tomar esa decisión, ¿no? Entonces, o sea, no solo es absurdo, sino que aparte hay expertos de sobra que eran conscientes de que eso no podía tener lugar. No solo eso, sino que aparte tienes a un montón de testigos que fueron parte de las conversaciones que tenían lugar dentro de la Casa Blanca para decir, oye, que es que esto lo sabían, es que Trump lo sabía, Rudy Giuliani lo sabía, todos los abogados que había dentro de la Casa Blanca, salvo alguna excepción, y eran todos externos, no eran de los que estaban como parte del equipo de Pat Cipollone, que se hablaba de él a lo largo de esta sesión, eran conscientes de que eso no se podía y lo volcaron, ¿no?, sobre Trump en el despacho Oval. Dijeron, oye, que no podemos seguir por esta vía. Presionaron incluso con dimitir. Y aún así, pues llegamos al 6 de enero con ese meeting previo al asalto al Capitolio, que lo que estaba dejando claro Trump y sus aliados, los que defendían estas teorías disparatadas, estaban dando argumentos a sus votantes, al menos a sus seguidores que había en aquella manifestación, para que dijeran, oye, mira, os están robando las elecciones en vuestra cara, Mike Pence tiene esta opción cuando en realidad no la tiene. Entonces, todo esto son un poco argumentos para demostrar que las teorías de la conspiración en torno a la gran mentira eran mucho más heavies de lo que pensábamos antes, que además venía de una estructura de personas que presionaban a Trump pese a que no fueran parte de la Casa Blanca, y que al final eso se saldó con el asalto al Capitolio, que pudo tener las consecuencias tan terribles a las que pues podían haber, yo qué sé, cogido a Mike Pence y cargárselo, por ejemplo, ¿no? Porque había gente tan extremista dentro de la gente que se coló en el Capitolio. Otros tantos, pues bueno, se metieron por meterse, ¿no? Pero la violencia la vimos, ¿no? Y los vídeos que se han visto al respecto es un poco más de lo mismo. Anyway, lo dicho, estaré pendiente un poco de qué titulares salen de esta... Ah, mira, si está más animado ahora, ¿qué le pasa?
Have said is the inartful wording of that sentence in the 12th Amendment. Scholars before 2020 would have used that historical precedent to argue not that Vice President Pence could overturn the 2020 election by accepting non-certified state electoral votes, but they would have made arguments as to some substantive, not merely procedural, authority possessed by the Vice President of the United States on the statutorily prescribed day for counting the Electoral College votes. This is constitutional mischief.
Oh, Judge, I think that's a good point, and I think it kind of begs the question that if the vice president had this power to determine the outcome of a presidential election, why hasn't it ever been used before? Why hasn't that ever happened?
Claro, ¿por qué no se ha usado antes? Si tiene ese poder el vicepresidente, ¿por qué no se ha usado
antes? And instead, as the chairman mentioned in his opening, for over 2 centuries, vice presidents have presided over the joint sessions of Congress in a purely ceremonial role. This even includes, as Mr. Jacob mentioned, Vice President Al Gore. For those of us who are old enough to remember, the 2000 election came down to one state, Florida. There were weeks of recounts and litigation after the election,
año 2000 fue una
and Al
locura,
Gore
tío.
conceded.
O sea, que por unos pocos miles de votos se decidieron las elecciones en Florida.
At the time. But he never suggested that he could simply declare himself the winner of the 2000 election when he presided over the counting of the electoral votes. Let's hear what Vice President Gore said when he described the situation he faced in 2000.
A ver.
Importance of the United States of America in all of human history. In Lincoln's phrase, we still are the last best hope of humankind. And the choice between one's own disappointment in your personal career and upholding the noble traditions of America's democracy is a pretty easy choice when it comes down to it.
Mr. Jacob.
Bueno. O sea, Al Gore en el año 2000 perdió las elecciones presidenciales contra George Bush hijo por Florida, por unos pocos miles de votos. Entonces además hubo problemas con las papeletas, hubo bastante polémica porque se presentaron unos desafíos, o sea, ¿cómo se dice? Retos judiciales, ¿se dice? No. Bueno, se presentaron unas demandas, ¿no?, para descubrir en realidad qué es lo que había pasado, si había votos que no se estaban contando, si se habían votado algunos de más, si se habían equivocado en la forma de contar ciertas papeletas, que además creo que eran las papeletas mariposa, que eran súper polémicas. Bueno, pero en fin, el caso es que el tema llegó al Tribunal Supremo, el Supremo tomó una decisión a favor de Bush y terminaron las elecciones a favor del que terminó siendo el presidente durante 8 años, durante una época trascendental para Estados Unidos, ¿no? 11 de septiembre, guerra de Irak, guerra de Afganistán, pero... El caso es que Al Gore era vicepresidente con Bill Clinton. Entonces, Al Gore presidió la ceremonia de la certificación de los resultados electorales del año 2000. Unas elecciones que había perdido por solo unos pocos miles de votos en un solo estado en Florida. Y no tuvo el valor, la osadía de desafiar esos resultados, pese a que había perdido solo por unos pocos miles de votos, porque sabía que, como ha dicho en esas declaraciones, era más importante defender la democracia, ¿no? No, o sea, es lo mismo que hizo Mike Pence. Mike Pence al final se puso por encima de sus intereses personales o de los intereses personales de Donald Trump para certificar esos resultados. Pero bueno, el caso, seguiré pendiente, luego os cuento más si hay alguna revelación importante. Gracias por haber venido por este stream y haber aguantado conmigo esas declaraciones del juez Lutti, que madre mía, o sea, me santiguo de pensar lo que tienen que aguantar ahora mismo las millones de personas que estén viendo esto. Un abrazo a todos, nos vemos mañana para los viernes cinéfagos y poco más. Que vaya todo bien. Bye bye. Besitos. Adiós. Adiós.